Hi everyone, Odie here. Welcome back to the channel. This week I wanted to give you a couple tips and tricks that we have found after doing the last two bosses of the raid on both heroic and normal difficulty. As always, if you like the content, please like and subscribe on the video, and I'll see you guys back next time. Starting things off on Ansurek, I think it's really important that you take time to focus on getting the mechanics and the flow of P1 right before you actually start worrying about positioning. A lot of people did this with Smolderon as well, where they tried to focus on actual placement and worrying about space positioning too much too early on, instead of actually just focusing on the mechanics. And it really ends up hindering your progress because you may not actually need to care about the space constraints of the room that much if you find out that once you have the mechanics down, you just blow through the phase. So the first tip is to definitely make sure you focus on the mechanics and the actual order of mechanics in P1 before you really start worrying about if you're going to run out of space or not. Specifically talking about mechanics, the actual P1 bomb explosions have sort of two strategies that have been floating around. The most common one that you might think of is to place one bomb for, say, the melee group and one bomb for the range group, maybe a little bit farther away from the boss, maybe in a couple of different formations, a V formation in a straight line, and then pop those accordingly depending on when the wave is going to get to those bombs. However, a new strat has surfaced by a couple different teams. I know Echo has used this as well because they're using helpers. It's a little bit more forgiving on if people die early on because the bombs require a minimum number of people to be in them. The minimum is half of your raid. So if you have people dead, you end up getting punished no matter what. So this other strategy is kind of a workaround for that. It really helps with helpers. However, it is a little bit more difficult to execute perfectly. And the strategy is that instead of placing your two bombs in different positions, maybe one for the melee, one for the range, you would instead overlap those bombs in like a Venn diagram sort of shape, and you would have the entire raid stand in the middle of that Venn diagram. The difficulty here is that you now have to pop both of those bombs at roughly the same exact time. Maybe it's like a half-second window that you have. So this just obviously increases the difficulty on the bomb poppers to really be in sync. However, it reduces the difficulty of the overall mechanic because you no longer really care about if people die and having to switch people between groups really quickly to try and make up the evenness between the groups, or if you just have a straight even number of people in your raid. So you have 20 people in your raid, 10 and 10. If one person dies, you're going to have an uneven number of people in the groups, and you're going to take extra stacks from the debuff. So having the entire raid in that Venn diagram does basically eliminate that because the bombs only care about if there's too few people in a bomb. So if you explode both the bombs at the same time, there is the full raid in each bomb. So you still get the minimum stacks that you could possibly get from the bombs. You should absolutely have everybody in your raid get a Wrest Yoink Weakaura for basically everything after P1. So the boss is going to do its Wrest cast. I think it's like a 5 or 6 second cast, and yoink people into the boss. This happens continuously in intermission, but it also happens in P2. It is critical for people to get a giant Weakaura that puts a cast timer bar on their screen or something for Wrest, maybe even with a countdown, so that they know without really having to pay attention to the raid leader or anything else when the actual pull is going to happen. You're going to get really upset if certain people continuously make the mistake of getting pulled into the boss and eaten in intermission, or pulled off the edge because they weren't paying attention to the timing of the yoink in phase 2. So make sure that all of your raiders have a timer bar Weakaura, hopefully with a countdown, for the Wrest cast going off. In phase 2, you split your raid into 2 teams, and both healers in each of those groups, if you have 3, it only goes on 2 healers, but basically 2 healers in each of those groups will get a debuff that needs to be dispelled as they are going up to the second platform, I believe, in P2. This debuff hurts like really hard, 2.6 million damage to everyone in that group whenever it is dispelled. And if you just let them time out, they will effectively one-shot your group, doing 5.2 million damage because they'll hit at the same time. The easiest way that we've found to deal with this is the moment the debuffs go out, you should dispel one immediately and just let the other one sit until likely after the pull happens on whatever group the pull is going on, because it rotates between one group and the other. Or you could just let the second one completely time out. This is usually a lot better than trying to dispel them closer together or both after the pull or something like that. It helps to just spread out the damage as much as possible and get one over quickly. A slight optimization to raid comp, if you have these classes in your raid, would be to split your mages and your warriors into separate groups in P2. The reasoning for this is that mages, depending on when you break the actual intermission shield, but pretty much always, mages have their CDs line up very well for the shield ad in phase 2 that needs to be burned down before it can finish its cast. So you really want your mages on separate platforms for that. And the other thing is warriors are doing a crap ton of instant AoE damage, which you get all of the little tiny mobs as you go up the ramp through each platform. So warriors are really good for actually killing those. So having those split between your two groups will help to even it out. So you're not having one group kill the smallies really easily, but then can't kill the absorb shield ad, or the other group nuking the absorb shield ad and their tank is dying because the small things are still up. So splitting those two classes up will really help your P2 evenness and consistency. An overall tip for P3, again, similar to P1, is to kind of learn the dance and the mechanics and the flow of the fight before worrying about any specific positioning stuff too much. It's really important to just get a good idea of what is going to happen next so people can pre-plan their positioning ahead of time, and then you may not ever have to really talk about any specific positioning between people. So just make sure you guys actually learn the dance of P3, what mechanics are going to happen next, and get more comfortable with that before you actually get to that phase. It'll make P3 a lot easier, and P3 is already one of the easier versions of the fight so far. With that being said, one thing that I would like to comment on is to keep the positioning of the Infest debuff that goes on the tank relatively close to the boss, and also Royal Condemnation. I'll talk about that in a second. But the Infest debuff is basically the debuff that goes on the tank, and when it goes off, it's going to summon a bunch of small ads that need to be nuked down. Keeping that close to the boss really does help to keep your boss damage high, especially with the melee. So generally you want to run that away from the boss, likely behind you in whatever direction you're going. And keep the outer circle, because it has about a 15-yard radius circle or something like that on the tank. Keep that circle basically touching the boss's hitbox. That's about as close as you'll want it. And then when those ads spawn, everybody can switch over to them really quickly, nuke them down, and then get back to the boss. The other mechanic, Royal Condemnation, targets 2 players, I believe, always on Heroic and Normal. On Heroic specifically, it spawns a web cocoon after 5 seconds of the debuff running out, wherever those players currently are, and that does fall off damage to the raid. It's actually a really good idea to put these cocoons basically where these people are going to drop them, really close to the raid and in front of where the raid is. You're going to take more damage from the fall off AoE damage. The 2 people who are dropping it are going to get hit really hard because they're really close to each other. However, having those cocoons next to each other is very, very good for being able to kill them, and having them in front of the boss is very good for being able to kill them because you're going to be moving towards them as you handle other mechanics. For those of you who don't know, those cocoons will basically put a web to your entire raid, like half the raid for one cocoon, half the raid for the other, and be slowly pulling them towards them. So again, having that in front is really good, so you're being pulled to where you want to go anyway. And having them in front helps to not have to be turning around and hitting something behind you and then switching back to the boss. If you have them behind you, you can't really stack the boss on top of them and do cleave damage. So make sure that those 2 positioning things are something that you think about. Try and keep the Infest tank debuff behind you and still as close as you can, and keep the Royal Condemnation debuff drops in front of you and close together so that you can pull the boss on top of them and nuke them down. The last thing I wanted to talk about is not so much a tip, just for people to understand how the essence mechanic works in P3. This is the basically item that drops from the ads that you kill in P3 that players have to pick up. And the way the Dungeon Journal says it is basically that a player who's holding this item, when they go through the portals that exist in P3, will destabilize and collapse the portal. And it wasn't really clear what that meant. People were worried about making sure that the person who holds the essence item is going through the portal absolutely last because it's going to immediately stop working. That's not really how it works on Heroic. It might work like that on Mythic, but obviously we don't know yet. But really on Heroic, all that happens is you pick up this thing. I'm pretty sure it does damage to whoever's holding it. And then when you go through the portal, like 3 to 5 seconds after you go through, the portal blows up and stops working. So it's not really something that you even have to think about. It's pretty much just saying like go through the portal as an entire group, instead of having the person who picks up the essence go through the portal like immediately when the wave starts to spawn and like screwing everybody else over. Really, as long as you go through as a group, or even roughly as a group, it's going to be fine. You actually have a lot of time before the portal itself actually like destabilizes and blows up. So it's not something that you really have to worry about.